For our Veriton friends, it's Maynard, Mike, and Arjun here with something that we've been super excited about for a number of weeks now. Paul Dabbar is joining us. He was the Undersecretary for Science at the DOE from 2017 to 2021. He's someone that Arjun knows personally from his interactions at Columbia. But Paul's experience and breadth of experience in energy really makes this, sets up for a fantastic conversation. He was a naval officer. He was a submarine officer. He worked at JP Morgan for a long time. And then, of course, was in government. And more recently, at the Hoover Institution, he wrote a paper entitled US Energy Superpower Status and a New US Energy Diplomacy. And it has many of the themes and discussion points that we enjoy talking about at Veriton. Let me stop now and just say, Paul, it's a delight to have you. We can't wait to talk about your paper, your career, your impressions, and certainly what we should be thinking about in energy. Thank you for joining.
It's great. It's great to be on with you all. I think this is a really exciting time for energy and the United States. America's global energy leadership hit a new high today with the EIA and U.S. oil production. But U.S. energy leadership is very broad-based in terms of its aspects and the impact of how we think about it in the world. The U.S. needs to think differently about how to utilize that.
Well, and we're going to attach when we send out today's podcast, we're going to attach your paper. And I think your paper has you just really articulate the themes in a way that's refreshing and exciting for all of us. So thank you again for joining. Mike, before we jump in with Paul, what would you tell us about the markets or anything else?
Yeah, Maynard, what I'd say is, the markets right now are looking at interest rates, broader markets, commodities, and really I want to kind of focus on the utility and energy sectors today. But just from a bond market standpoint, we had PPI print today, a little bit hotter than expected. You would expect that would have knocked the market down, but the market didn't get knocked out. It kind of just continued to go up, and it's really because of this risk-on trade. It feels like markets are just more concerned right now, or we'll put it this way, they're less concerned with interest rates and more concerned or looking more at AI and this euphoria in AI. So that continues to keep the market going. I'd say it's, from a broader market standpoint, like I said, we continue to hit all-time highs. Bitcoin just hit an all-time high. And so it really is a risk-on trade going on right now. When that ends, nobody knows. One of the things I'd say from a commodity standpoint, WTI has really been in a pretty tight range over the last couple of weeks, in the $77, $79 area. The other thing we note is WTI time spread. We've been noting how they've been in really steep backwardation. They pulled off a little bit this week, but they still are in steep backwardation. So they really kind of tell you that the markets physically are still tight. Today, what did we get? OPEC today basically updated their growth demand estimates for 2024 and 2025. Unchanged. 2024 is roughly 2.2 million barrels a day. 2025 is 1.8 million barrels a day. And that's pretty robust. If you see U.S. growth kind of stagnate from here, you're going to have a pretty constructive market for crude oil. So we'll see how that develops. I'd say from lower, just if you look at natural gas is down a little bit this week. The thing I'd point out is a couple things. First, you have U.S. storage is about 32% above normal, like 570 Bs above normal. And that's kind of keeping a top on prompt price. But what I also noticed today is that CNX basically lowered their production targets for 2024 by about 30 BCF. And we saw that with Equitable a couple weeks ago as well. And we saw that with Chesapeake, 3-4 weeks ago. And so producers are cutting. So that's a good thing. The last thing I'd really want to focus on is sort of the energy and utility sectors is, maybe 4 things. First, Shell is going to put out an energy transition report this week. Most people think that they're going to lower their emission targets in the intermediate and longer term. So we'll see what happens there on Thursday. Second thing is a headline that came out today, talking about the UK will allow power plants to continue to be built, new power plants through the 2030s. And that's just a difference of gas plants. Yeah, gas plants. And that kind of is stunned some people. And I'd say that first point I made and the second point, that really just shows you that there's this climate backpedaling going on, because I think some realism is getting built in Arjun. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that as well. The last thing we've really been talking about is this data center growth. And what really interested me is this week, EQT Corp is looking to buy Equitrans. And I'm not going to talk about the deal or any of those aspects. What really kind of intrigued me is Toby talked about AI demand on the MVP system. He talked about natural gas generation demand. He talked about power plants being built in that area. And so what I would say is the main point I took away from that, and the main point we've been trying to stress over the last 3 or 4 weeks is natural gas demand, power demand is going to be much higher than people think it's going to be. Most people that get bullish on gas equities, natural gas equities, really kind of talk about LNG out to 2030, the 12 to 13, 14 BCF a day that's coming on. I think what we're missing is that AI demand from data centers is going to be as big or bigger than that going forward. So I think we could be looking at a market in 2030 timeframe that could be 125 to 130 BCF a day. And so I think it gets lost in the shuffle here. And so I think we got a really robust market building up here. We just got to get through the next 6, 9, 12 months. We'll hand it back to you.
Sorry, just so you said Consol is cutting production.
Yeah, they're coming at about 30 BCF in total.
Off their annual.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Arjun, what would you throw in?
Maynard, I'm going to build upon both of the themes Mike just mentioned. And, we spent a lot of time at Veriden. I write a lot in Super Spiked about the massive unmet energy needs of the other 7, and it will soon be 9 billion people on Earth, and their aspiration to joining all of us who are amongst the lucky 1 billion in terms of our energy usage and therefore the lifestyles and the economies we all, frankly, take for granted. And the basic thought was been that recognition and those energy needs is leading ultimately to what we'll call a healthier energy evolution. All the policies and thought processes that go into how we think about energy, those should be moving in a healthier direction. Then I'll say that low point kind of after COVID, maybe timed with the IEA's net zero by 2050 report, where the climate narrative became the be all and end all. We support and think there is a need to address all of our environmental issues, but it has to be in the context of meeting the world's energy needs first and foremost. What's interesting about the AI development, and I think Mike spends a lot of great time talking about this, Maynard, you have, and on COBT we have, is that what has been, I think, a rest of world focus. How can we harness America, and I always say, and Canada's oil and gas resources, but the new energies as well, new technologies, electric cars, battery technologies, et cetera, to meeting the rest of the world's energies. Now that's coming home as well. Artificial intelligence is going to make real load growth in this country that we've not seen in a long, long time. And it was always going to be intolerable for both tech companies, but more importantly, American consumers to have temporary power, to have blackouts, to have interruptions. And that's not to blame any technology. That is not some secret code word for renewables are bad. It is a recognition that if you're going to have renewables, what is going to be the base load or the backup to match that intermittency? And is it going to be natural gas? Is it going to be nuclear? And we're going to talk about some of this with our guest today. But when you start building in load growth from what has been basically a flat kind of historic demand outlook, it creates a sense of urgency that hasn't existed previously. And I think is going to accelerate what we're going to call a healthy evolution to a much better narrative around all these energy issues. I think the related topic, Maynard, I think all of us at Veriden have to spend more time thinking about, and we'll do in the months and years ahead, is what is the role for traditional energy in all this? And so we recognize that oil and natural gas are going to be needed, especially in the rest of the world. And I think there's a huge role to play on product exports, crude exports, LNG exports, and frankly, export of some of the newer technologies. I think, though, if you say power generation load growth is going to start creeping up, that historically has not been in the purview of oil and gas companies. And it has been my view, I've written about this extensively, they should stick to their knitting. That's been my basic line. Don't make them do new energies if they don't know anything about it. Don't think they're going to be good at power generation. I think we do have to at least ask the question. I'm not advocating for this. I'm asking the question, should there be any change in that perspective? Is it at least worth studying? And I think Mike just did a great job articulating what is likely to be newfound growth in gas-fired power demand. We've had that before. We've not asked gas companies to be vertically integrated, but it is a different world in terms of trying to deal with emissions, of big tech wanting to partner with energy companies to ensure they have reliable, dedicated, if not distributed, but at least dedicated power. And so again, we're just going to ask the question, should we have an open mind to think about what are the opportunities for traditional energy to be involved? I'm going to say with quotes, the broad power sector, where historically we would have said, I'm not sure that makes sense. As you know, I don't believe there's a decade, let alone year, where we know when oil demand is going to peak. I do think, though, it is reasonable to say power generation demand growth is going to be faster than, say, gasoline demand growth over at least the next 10 years. And I think that does have to make you think a little bit differently, possibly, about some of these subjects. I think just a final point, Maynard, as a segue to our guest, I'm as excited as anybody. I know you always say how excited you are for the guest, Maynard. I am truly excited to have Paul Dabbar this week. You mentioned our Columbia affiliation. We're both on Jason Bordoff's advisory board, but actually, of my 4 non-Veridan boards, I'm full-time at Veridan. We share an advisory board at Columbia, at ClearPath, and we've both been senior advisors at Warburg Pincus. So actually on 3 of them, I had the great fortune to be working with Paul. And the only one I'm not is ConocoPhillips. His brother is an employee at ConocoPhillips. So I've got a Dabbar involved in all of my affiliations. And the only one I didn't was actually Veritan. So Maynard, you have completed my personal circle of life to have a Dabbar involved in all of my affiliations now that he's going to be here on CBT. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. And Paul, it is awesome to see you. I'm blessed to have an affiliation with you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, that was a great tour. I feel like if this were baseball, you just hit for the cycle, Arjun. You got all the Dabbars. Paul, it's really awesome to have you. As I mentioned up front, your background is so extensive. From the military to JP Morgan. You're on the board at Dominion. You hear lots of things debated. You see the policy side. You've been in government, and now you just champion this paper, kind of bringing it all together in a way that I can't say that I've seen it done quite this well. Because you, in a world of energy where we're often talking about flavors, or we're talking about various sides, you're reminding us there is the American sort of suite of strengths here, and it includes oil and gas and technology and lithium batteries and all these great technologies. And don't forget amazing capital markets that finance all this stuff. It's a great articulation of what makes America special and why it should be in a unique position to hopefully lead the world and maybe change its attitude about how it leads the world, realize the strengths the country has. That was a very interesting sort of subtext, like, hey, let's hold our heads up and be a little bit better leaders. But let me ask you to just kick us off, talk about the paper or anything else you think is a good place to start.
Yeah, so let me talk to you about at least my philosophy of policy, and then I'll talk about kind of the paper terms. And so I'm a big supporter of what I would call all the above policy. And the energy sector is very fragile. It's very just in time. Obviously, the electricity sector is very, very close to just in time, very little storage in the big scheme of things. But the oil and gas sector actually doesn't have, as everyone knows, not that much storage compared to total demand. And so things need to be moving constantly. And so it's very fragile. The energy sector is very, very fragile. And you never know when a disruption, some sort of event, could disrupt something and have ripple effects either locally or globally. And the 4 all the above policy points I'd like to mention is energy production and availability. The second one is prices. The third one is emissions, and the last one is national security. And if people forget about one or two to focusing on one or the others, we've seen that in Germany, obviously, in the last couple of years. I mean, there's obviously the power sector in the US where we're seeing more retirements than construction, so we're actually de-electrifying. Those are somewhat dangerous sort of situations. So the word I like to use is balance in policy. You need to have balance. You need to have awareness, and you need to think about all those interactions and all those drivers. And so I always like to kind of start with that in terms of that kind of framework that I think it's valuable, or else things are going to have a real challenge. In the papers, as you mentioned, I wanted to take a bit of a step back and kind of analyze like where the U.S. has gotten to, and it gets lost. The forest gets lost in the trees of us kind of diving into emissions this or LNG exports that, which are all very important. But take a little bit of a step back and take a look at the survey of where the U.S. is. How did it get to where we are here today, and the implications of that from a global interaction perspective? And so, in the big scheme of things, the U.S. went from the largest importer of energy in the world to now the largest exporter of energy of energy in the world. The U.S. drove that not only in oil and gas, but through innovation, brought on board things that were not commercial 20 years ago within the last generation. So obviously all the different drilling technologies, but wind wasn't really working very well 20 years ago from a turbine point of view. PV solar wasn't. Lithium-ion batteries was a science experiment that was funded by DOE and the National Science Foundation 20 years ago. All these things kind of built up over the course of the last 20 years for a few of those reasons that kind of built up that kind of our production capacity for energy. But on top of that, the U.S. clearly leads the world in discovery of new technologies. It doesn't come close in terms of who's sitting either in the private sector or again, chemistry and energy production technologies and so on. The invention of new technologies, the U.S. dominates that. No other party comes close to the invention of new technologies. Manufacturing, I would argue, we're okay. Some people like to focus on one or the others, but obviously some things like oil and gas services, right? The manufacturing side of oil and gas, U.S. has a very strong position on that. A lot of turbines still made in this country through GE and Westinghouse of various different types of turbines. So there's a number of things across manufacturing. U.S. still has a very, very big global footprint on. Some on the new technology side, that's evolving, right, in terms of that. But the totality of it, U.S. is a very, very strong manufacturer across the board for energy. And then, Maynard, as you mentioned, the last one, which the U.S. dominates just in a stunning fashion, is capital markets. The capital raising for the energy sector, the U.S. swamps the rest of the world. London, if you look at the London markets kind of in aggregate, they're number 2 in the world, and they're about 10% of the United States. So if you look at not just the public markets, but the private markets, the venture markets, the PE markets, and so on. So you take that all up together, the U.S. dominates the world in energy. It doesn't come close. Saudi Arabia doesn't come close. Russia doesn't come close. China doesn't come close. And so I think, just kind of starting with an assessment of where we're at before starting to think about implications is a good place to start.
No, that was great, Paul. And as I was listening to you, we've all obviously read the paper. It's a little bit like the paper is pointing to, we need some more, we need an appreciation for all these strengths, but we need some more strategic thinking around the hand that we're sitting on. And we should be thinking about how we're using the hand, to help our friends. Where are some weaknesses that we need to adjust? But it seems like if I could hold the paper up and it had a watermark, it seems like the watermark would say, be thinking strategically, America, about where you are, what you have, how this could play out, and how you can kind of help the good guys, for lack of a better word, with this hand you've been dealt.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a few layers to that. First of all, there is still things that we can do domestically, which is a longer topic to maximize that. And then you start, at least I start thinking about concentric circles of friends, for, kind of like near abroad, slightly. Like
the airlines have. I'm still working my way to that, top, circle.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then you start thinking about adversaries, right? And the impact of what the power has for adversaries. So, Arjun's, I'm just piling on Arjun's thing that he talks about a lot. You start with Canada, right? The U.S. and Canadian markets are highly intertwined by ownership, by infrastructure, production, and so on, shipping, right, transportation. And so it's really one market for many different reasons. And I think one of the stunning things is that, in addition to the U.S., is that just in December, the combined oil and gas production, just sticking with oil and gas as a metric of power and of strength, the combined oil and gas production of the United States and Canada combined is more than the combined oil and gas production now of the whole of the Persian Gulf. And that is a stunning statement, right? I think most people don't realize that happened in December, that the shift of power, as Jürgen was talking about the shale revolution in one of his previous books, that shift of power from the Persian Gulf to North America is now complete. And so you start with Canada, right? And you start about how we engage with our closest, an integrated partner. And Mexico is certainly a part of it. Mexico has a bit more kind of challenges around coordination, but they're certainly a part of it. But you take at least the U.S.-Canada portion, and you start there about how we engage with the world, given the footprint.
Maybe I'll just grab the Canada topic while we're right here on it, because you do make the point in the paper that the two countries together are this, amazing holding tank of energy, power and capability. But and as many things as we have in common with Canada, it often depends on who's in power where as to who's thinking what where, right? And one of the things that's striking about Canada, for all we have in common with Canada, I mean, Canada could write a similar paper about all their capabilities, but right now it doesn't seem like Canada thinks at all about, hey, look at what we could do in the world if we really did an all of the above strategy. Instead, they're just in a different mindset. Any observations on the way we need government alignment to really capture the power of that type of partnership?
Yeah, I mean, my paper is a little bit of a call of, as Arjun was saying, a bit of a call of awareness. And once again, all the above policy points include some things that the current Canadian government cares about, i.e. emissions, right? And so I think it's a bit of a call, not just to the U.S., but certainly also to Canada and the political side, that the balance topic is equally as important to them, and there's value in that. And you could use these things for different goals, right? And so you could, if you may have a subset of those goals you care a little bit more about than the others of those policies, but why not use the power that you have? And so this is a little bit of a call, not only for the United States, but our closest ally in the energy sector is a bit of a call of awareness around that balance. And then once again, how to use it for whatever policies that you're most interested in.
You also make the observation the three Western nations with the most energy impact are the US, Canada, and Norway. And those three nations should be working together, sitting together, kind of like a G7 type mindset, comparing notes, asking what are the impacts of their policy, providing leadership. I think is a great suggestion, but what would you add along those lines?
Yeah, I've talked with some on the government-owned side of the oil sector, and I think they're open to the topic of having a regular coordination. I think there is an interest in further dialogue. It's a lot of power when you pull together the U.S., Norway, and Canada as fellow members of NATO, treaty allies, democratic nations, all care about emissions. And the combined power of the U.S. and Canada alone is already quite strong. And you throw in Norway, it's over 50% of OPEC if you just want to pick on oil. That's just three countries is over 50% of all of OPEC. And I think Norway would also have interest in a forum that could be a counterweight to others in the world.
Yeah, Paul, I'm just going to kind of piggyback on what Arjun talked about earlier is, electricity growth over the last 20 years has been between 0 and 1%, maybe 0.5% or something like that. And I guess, you being on Dominion board, I don't want you to talk specifically about that, but just I see the electric utility companies that got into the non-regulated businesses, the renewable businesses, really kind of stepping back and saying, you know what, over the next decade, we're going to be back to our sort of rate-based growth. And honestly, that's going to be a really, really good business because I view it as a growth business given the electricity. I guess my question for you is, it's gigantic, the demand we're going to see. Are utilities commissions are basically ratepayers? I mean, do you think they're aware of this, or I mean, are getting ahead of it, or are they prepared for it?
I think if you look at the integrated resource plans, i.e., your utility projections that they publicly, that a lot of them publicly are required to put out, you're seeing just in the last month or two some radical shifts up, right? You could, I think they're just beginning to get their hands around the fact that it's not going to be 0 to 1% like it was for a couple of generations. Most utilities, fully regulated earnings growth is probably in the 5 to 7% range, which kind of is linked to its rate-based growth, right? So that's how much capex they spend, and to a large degree, that's that's going to be you're going to see that as the driver of power demand going up. It's not going to be quite 5 to 7%, but there's some areas of the country. You mentioned data centers, obviously, Loudoun County. Virginia, outside of DC, is seeing the world's largest growth of local power demand, all driven by data centers, and so there's give or take around 3,000 megs now, and just a portion of Loudoun County. I don't even know what it is fully when you look at the co-op area, the municipal area, but you look at the growth associated with it. I was talking with a developer who plans over a series of additions at one building of a data center in Loudoun County is going to be 900 megawatts. So one building is going to be one large nuclear power plant. And we haven't seen that since the Manhattan Project, when they built power plants to run one building for the Manhattan Project in Tennessee. Now you're going to see one large nuke for one building. And that's just one of, many others. I think that's really at the tip of the iceberg. It's not just all about Washington and the defense demand for cloud. It's going all over the world. I've seen the data for Paris and London and so on, and it's going to be quite high.
Paul, maybe I'll build upon that. I spend so much time talking about the need for the developing world to get recognized for how much less energy they use. That's just for like normal stuff, like powering a home that's currently burning cow dung, as an example, or any iteration along the way, the lack of driving that occurs that is going to come into the world. When you think about China and India, AI is going to clearly be a huge component of how they think about the world. China for sure, India almost for sure. And when we think about their normal demand growth that would have come from an energy and economic S-curve, layer in AI, and clearly we're talking about a lot of energy demand. What's striking about both those countries, China and India, is they have a lot of coal. And so if I mix in sort of the emissions question and then marry it with your energy superpower, which we are, or we in Canada could together be, how do we think about, and again, China may be an adversary now, so maybe I'll focus on India. How do we think about, I guess, partnering or helping India meet both its basic, and then I'm going to call it turbocharged economic growth due to AI, and get them to not go down China's coal path? Because it's very tempting. It's domestic, it's low cost, it's jobs, it's taxes, it's local bureaucracy. There's a lot of motivations to use domestic coal. What would be the policy prescriptions that we as Americans, as the American government, can help them meet their energy demand from lower carbon emission sources that would compete with really cheap domestic coal in India?
So if you look at, once again, the totality of American power, right? Innovation, manufacturing, production, depending on the country, we could put together a package, and a package is a little bit too strong of a word, but an engagement that's cross cuts. It's not just about LNG. It's not just about turbine manufacturing. It's about the totality. And so being very thoughtful about diplomatic policy and energy. So let's take India, right? Historically, the United States, around the world, led by the oil and gas companies, were very outward looking in terms of investment around jobs, around production in that local area, right? The countries, obviously during the 40s and 50s and 60s, and Exxon and the Texas company and, so on, right? The former Texaco, was very much at the forefront. We've pulled back. The oil companies are like the last few ones that are doing it, but the power companies like Enron or a lot of US utilities and so on pull back when there's very few actually who have been driving development overseas. And there's a lot of reasons for that, too long to get into. But if we could, if we could re-energize the private sector, supported by federal government programs that make it easy to export, the Exim Bank, right, and a number of the new the direct equity side that the U.S. can support, making certain that export permits are easier, and then go to those countries and say, we want to be your partner, right? And we want to be your partner in things that are good for you, good for your costs, good for your emissions, and be much more forthright than I think as many people read. The Chinese are a bit more mercantile about even how they supposedly make offers, right? It's their own equipment, they ship their own people, right, to make it. Many times they don't work, right? There's dams that are cracking that were only built a few years ago, so there's a quality issue. There's a security issue, obviously, associated with this. So there's a lot of downsides to taking kind of Chinese investment. We have a lot more to offer, right? The portfolio of what we have to offer is way better, right, than the Chinese have. And so going to India and trying to cut across all those at a big push, the sum is much higher than the sum of the parts, so to speak, and we can do that with many countries around the world.
Maybe just a follow up there, Paul. When I think about your policy prescriptions and us partnering with other countries with all that we have to offer, I think that's going to be good for our country, but I think it's going to be good for these partner countries as well, because they're not just going to be getting our oil and oil products, and not just our LNG, which can be a source of dependable power that's separate from burning your own coal, but they're going to get the new technologies as well, most of which, or almost all of which, are going to be lower carbon intensity. Does the world need to have these explicit carbon reduction goals, which at least some governments and some folks in power are going to spend all their time talking about? And then we get the dynamic where other folks don't spend any time talking about it. Is there a need to have explicit carbon reduction goals, or is it implicit in the policy choices that you advocate for and make?
So, if you take a little bit of a step back in the United States, the U.S. used to emit all sorts of other gases, right, and things. So this is not a new topic. This is from my point of view. This is not a new topic. It's a different sort of gas. But we were dealing with SOx, we were dealing with NOx, we were dealing with mercury. We have particulate. There's a long history of emissions in the energy sector. So this is not a new topic. How did we solve this before? We actually solved it with innovation and technology that actually made it cost effective, so that the cost associated with reducing of NOx and SOx or mercury became pretty minor. Okay, in the big scheme of the energy production. And so I'm a big fan of, rather than trying to mandate things that there's no technology for, right, is to actually have an innovation-led strategy. And by the way, it's working, okay? It's actually working. And so the U.S., leads the world in the tons of emissions of carbon per year, by far leads the world. And that, I think that's going to continue under any sort of political or regulatory regime because of innovation. And so I personally think that rather than having regulation without a path towards a cost-effective execution of it, just leads to very high prices and political backlash. And so I, rather than thinking about regulation and targets of carbon, I would think it's much better to do what's been proven in the past in terms of let's invest in innovation and drive down costs concurrently, actually, with driving down emissions. That's actually what we've done. And so I'm a very positive person based on past, and also I have a reasonable visibility of technologies coming up, the prospects of them. And I'm very positive that curve can continue.
So, Paul, along those lines, it's a great lead in for my next question, which is, so you were Undersecretary for Science at DOE. You're a science thinking and embracing person. If you think back to some of the innovations that have happened in the U.S. energy space, DOE was an early proponent of, Section 29 credits and things that encouraged us to keep experimenting with shale gas. And then the private sector and private land and private capital came together to embrace all that technology. And where do you see government's best role? And because you've got like some tax incentive and some research, and then you've got all the way to the IRA, and there's probably some people would tell us there's something on the other side of IRA, which is stick and less carrot. Like where do you see the best balance, and do you think we need to make any changes where we are now?
Yeah, so what we were able to accomplish in the past, and including the not so recent past, was that we concurrently increased production and concurrently reduced emissions and concurrently had energy price deflation. Okay, it wasn't that long ago, right? That every year things were improving, right? Especially from like 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19. Every year, right? Emissions were dropping, prices were dropping, and energy availability was increasing, right? And so I very much push back on people that you can't have it all. We have had it all. And so how did that happen, right? It happened for three reasons, at least in the way I look at it. The primary trigger of that was energy innovation, right? Was inventing the future, all those different technologies that didn't exist 20 years ago. The second one was balanced all the above policy. And there was a lot of fighting in Washington over the 2005 Act and 2007 Act, the 2016 Budget Act, which traded PTCs and ITCs for a win for the lifting of the export ban, right? There's a series of these things that were ultimately bipartisan pro-supply. And that led to this incredible accomplishment of accomplishing everything all at once, right? And so that was step two of how we got there. And the last one was private sector investment. The private sector saw the innovation of all the different types of technology, saw balanced pro-supply policy out of the U.S. government, including things like siting, and money went through the roof, right? So depending on which sector that you look at, you all are experts at this, but if you look at upstream CapEx in North America, it went up by about 5 times, okay, from the bottom to the peak. That's a lot of increase in private sector investment. And you could do that with all the other sectors, right? Like wind and solar and EVs and whatnot. So those are the three areas that I think, can drive us to where we amazingly have gotten to. And I think if we go back to those policies of innovation, balanced policy, and allowing the capital markets to rush in when they see all that, I think that's the vision for the future that worked in the past.
So did you, I guess one of the things that's clearly at work in so many of the things that you're talking about are the markets and free enterprise. And it feels like there's even an implicit kind of pro-trade, global engagement. Have we drifted a little far in your mind? Maybe it was a post-COVID hangover of just too much in government involvement. This is like Thanksgiving. This is the kind of thing I would say, to my relatives and spoil the Thanksgiving. But do you think governments have gone too far in some of their policies, and we need to be a little more pro-market?
Yeah. So as you think about where and this is completely philosophical, and you can have a real debate. People have different views about this. So I'm gonna give the opinion warning here. Is where's the best place for government to be in? And what we've been doing recently has been industrial policy picking a certain narrow set of technologies. Okay, that's kind of what we've been doing, and a lot of high TRL level, i.e., like manufacturing ready to go technologies that and to put more government money into something which is clearly dominated by the private sector. So it's trying to encourage industrial policies in a narrow set of technologies, right? That's kind of what has been going on as policy. I would argue that that is actually generally the realm of the private sector. And in general, the private sector did a pretty good job of it. Once again, we don't have to go back very far to see what happened with the massive jump in energy production and emissions and so on in the previous generation. Historically, where does the private sector, or even currently, is not very interested in spending a lot of money in, and that's in discovery science of new technologies. You go to the oil and gas companies, you go to Exxon, you go to the utility companies like Duke, and you say, we want you to fund a $500,000 experiment in some new battery chemistry at NC State. Okay, the answer will be no. Okay, and so the private sector will not invest in the really early stage development that every once in a while something spits out of it and says the lithium ion chemistry works and we've driven down the cost and so on. That was a science experiment funded by the federal government, right? And we won the Nobel Prize when I was undersecretary. That was a fun dinner with the Swedes when we won the Nobel Prize that year. That's something the private sector does not fund well. That system is not really in place. So I would argue, in a very kind of traditional view, focus of government spending where the private too far away from cash flow for the private sector to invest. I think that's a better place to go. And then you have mechanisms in place, such as the venture capital sector and adoption areas where government starts dropping, starts dropping. And then when it gets to, we're going to go build a plant to make a widget, the private sector in general has done a better job rather than industrial policy.
Question for you, and you reference this in your paper when you talk about American leadership. There are a number of international bodies around the world that affect policy and energy choices, IMF, World Bank. You mentioned from our side, XM Bank. There's obviously the UN, and then there's organizations like IEA. How can the U.S., I think we've always found it interesting here, thinking about the developing world, the World Bank choices and IMF choices about what they will fund or not fund, those are really impactful to development and to climate and all kinds of things. How can U.S. leadership, a more ambitious and confident U.S. leadership, affect those organizations in a way that helps all of these goals, including the climate?
Yeah, so I haven't really used the word adversary yet, but now I'm gonna use that as we start thinking about some of these institutions. So clearly we have U.S. as adversaries in the world. Clearly Russia's an adversary. China's an adversary. China obviously produces a lot of energy technology and equipment that we never had that sort of competition from an adversary in the past. The Soviet Union never really was a competitor on this topic with us. And so the World Bank and the IMF are the majority shareholders are the United States and Europe. But if you actually look at what's been going on, is that they have been funding projects that are mostly very disproportionately Chinese, and a lot of them are high emissions. So it's a little funny to me, right? How did we get into that, format that the World Bank, which is a OECD, Bretton Woods, agency, is actually, we're using our money. It's really taxpayer money that is the shareholding interest of us in the World Bank to support things that are not aligned with what's the best interest of the American people
And Paul,
the voters.
while we're on it, Paul, just so we all know what you're talking about, like what would be an example of that, or what's a just help us visualize what exactly you're talking about in that.
So I'll give an example. The U.S. actually produces a bunch of wind turbines, a little bit less on the offshore side, but on the land side, GE is a very big producer of wind turbines. And the Chinese increasingly are trying to grab market share from the United States on onshore wind turbines, as well as Europeans, who are also quite good at producing wind turbines. That there's a quite disproportionate amount of those sort of renewable projects coming to support Chinese companies that frankly can be produced in the United States or can be produced in the OECD countries. And so the decision making at the World Bank about how that's done has dramatically shifted away from the largest shareholders. And when you think about, once again, you think about, from a national point of view, the United States, Canada, the European countries, we produce good stuff. I just gave you an example in the renewable space.
Mm-hmm.
Because of how the governance structure has shifted in some of these entities, it's actually the U.S. which can compete is no longer being selected, which is a bit strange.
Yeah, Paul, one of the things I find interesting is like over the last couple of years, we talked earlier about, sort of backpedaling. It seems like the growth in EVs has been really backpedaled here. Obviously, a lot of the auto manufacturers in the U.S. are kind of pulling a little bit back there, and I don't think that's a bad thing. But the question I want to ask you is, look at that versus Chinese. The Chinese are car companies. It's the biggest company in the world. It surpassed Tesla as the biggest producer in the world. And I guess my question is if you think about over the next maybe 5, 6, 8, 10 years, just from a policy standpoint, I know the U.S. really wants to get down our emissions, but there's also national security to be thinking about. I mean, do you ever see a scenario where the Chinese car company is allowed to basically sell cars here, just because our EV goals are so high and, the administration or whoever's in charge there? I mean, how do you balance the national security versus just getting your emissions down?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to compare your question of the United States versus Europe right now, because they're quite different. If there's a number of things that the Biden administration kept from the Trump administration. It doesn't get talked about tremendously, but there are several things that they maintained, and one of them was that President Trump put very large tariffs around various imports, including effectively EVs directly, fully made EVs from China. And President Biden kept it on. And so there's a lot of reasons why, that can make sense. I mean, part of it is just pure like manufacturing and jobs. There's some really scary things about controls that people have been reading, like about the cranes, Chinese cranes at ports. I'm going to say something pretty scary, but true. The power electronics that you can make in a piece of equipment, such as power electronics and controls or cars, you could have physical backdoors and chips. This isn't software, right? This is like a backdoor that you will never find in a chip. And someone can come along while you're driving the car and turn it off or turn on the brakes. It could at the extreme, it could kill somebody on purpose. Someone could come in and just jump into your car. This is not theoretical. And there's a lot of other things you can do with power electronics and your computers, right? And, the list is somewhat long. And so the national security implications and the personal implications of importing things like EVs that is kind of not a great idea. And so the Biden administration has generally kept that the Trump administration had put in place. And so I think that's very positive, I think, for the U.S. on your question. I think your question is much more worrisome, so to speak. There's more worries about your question in Europe. Europe has a very hard time, given the balkanized decision-making, to make big moves because every country kind of still does a little bit of their own thing. And so they're watching a bit more of the potential wave of Chinese cars swamping into Europe, which is actually even worse for them given the dominance of European car companies in their economies and their jobs. And so I would argue, although I'm not giving policy advice to Europe as in my old job, but I think just like Germany getting hooked on Russian gas was a national security risk that became an issue. It went from a theory that President Trump, for those of you who may remember, President Trump got up at the UN and lectured and said, "Germany, you're stuck on Russian gas, and you're going to regret it." And then they panned to the German team at the UN, laughing at him. And I would love to know who those 4 people are from Germany. I'd love to go meet with them and ask them what do they think now from laughing at President Trump exactly predicting the future. Same things can happen with cars, and having sympathy with Europe. I hope they figure out a mechanism that flooding the market that may happen on this EV topic in Europe. Hopefully, they could figure out some way for it not to happen.
Paul, I do hope everyone that is watching or listening to this will take the time to read your Hoover Institute Energy Superpower piece. And I wanted to go into one of the policy suggestions. There's a long list of outstanding policy suggestions, I'd say all of which I agree with. But I really was struck by the one that says reform the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act to prevent subsidizing adversary nations, energy companies, and technologies. And you used the word reform, not repeal, not abolish till the end of the earth, but reform. And I was wondering with the Inflation Reduction Act, I personally share those views. It's a subsidy-driven framework where some of the subsidies seem like they're kind of de facto picking winners. But could you elaborate on what you meant by reform the IRA, and why wouldn't we want to repeal it? And what are the other things we could do that sort of address some of the objectives above and beyond the IRA?
Yeah. So, what I was thinking about in the paper was, where is there consensus? And if there's one thing that there was consensus in Congress was not being interested in U.S. taxpayers subsidizing China. Even though there was no Republican support for the IRA, there was Republican support for the infrastructure investments. But whether even both sides agreed that the purpose of both of those bills, this is members of Congress, right? There was wide discussion and sections of the laws that were trying to basically say this is not meant to subsidize adversary nations, which is code words in legislation for Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. Those two don't matter as much in most of these topics. And so what's happened is that grants coming out of the various agencies and the IRA tax rules have been written in a way that runs contrary to, once again, I'm going to state an opinion here. I think the significant majority of Congress. So there's a wide support in Congress around not having American taxpayer money going to Chinese companies and supply chains, right? It's like you can have a debate about maybe whether, we should import something from China or not, but American taxpayer money helping the Chinese companies and supply chains is a widely bipartisan topic that it's a bad idea. For some reason, these tax rules and so on have been allowed to do that. And so that's a discussion that I don't know why it's been done. I could surmise that there's a portion of people who feel like it's important to ramp up lithium-ion battery use or EV use faster than we can domestically produce it, and therefore we need to pay the Chinese with our taxpayer money in order to accelerate that. I think that's a number of people that believe that. I do think that there is a wide bipartisan interest in the country and certainly in Congress that that's not where our taxpayer money should go to. So I think as you think about trying to find common ground, There may be other things to do, okay, with the Infrastructure Act or the IRA. I do think there's too much industrial policy and there's too narrow of technologies. I wrote a paper about picking the EV as the only car winner is probably not a great technology solution. So that's a separate topic of interest. I think there's other things to do in terms of reform, within that. But I think just cutting back the subsidies that are going to China to zero is widely bipartisan, and I think that's a good place to start.
Paul, one question, because China's come up a number of times, and as you were ticking through Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, if you put those on the big four of our, countries that like us the least, or are most competitive with us, or most don't want us to see us, don't want to see us succeed, the China thing just looms so large. Like conflict with China, not armed conflict, but just the competition with China over the next 20 years just seems like it's a defining variable in how we're going to be thinking about so many things. In your mind, do you think there's any way we could get off of this path with China? Is there any way to return to the notion we had, 15 years ago of China as a partner, China as a, part of the global trade? Is there any path back to a different relationship with China, or is the die cast?
I think for the foreseeable future, China has cast the die. And so this decision, primarily around them being an adversary, was not the U.S. decided all of a sudden that nothing changed at China and we just decided to change that. It was the exact opposite. And there's a lot of things that when you walk into government, which is very big. I mean, to a large degree, I ran most of what used to be the Manhattan Project, and I went back and watched the movie last night on the airplane. And and even in retrospect, I look back at my time of running this complex with awe and respect of having running something that kind of came from that background, and it's very humbling. But one of the things, besides the scale and the scope and the accomplishment of running that complex, when I showed up about how many people working at our national labs that came from the Manhattan Project had part-time jobs working for the Chinese Communist State. It was a stunning revelation that how many employees at the former Manhattan Project had part-time jobs working for the communist China. And the reason why is that there was no conflict of interest policy and no disclosure. I mean, I'm going to sound a little bit like a banker here with some, and some lawyers, but it's like, you got to have a disclosure of and have a conflict of interest policy if you're an employee of Goldman Sachs, right? And we had none. And as a result, we had people sharing discovery science on new topics like quantum and artificial intelligence and biotechnology with the Chinese Communist State. And it was fine. It was legal. It was okay. And so I went through a series of reforms that put controls, such as you can't work for the Communist State of China while you work at Los Alamos. I know that seems really silly, but that was okay when I showed up. That was okay. Right. Jeez. And hey, can we do joint work on quantum computing with the communist Chinese state? It was okay when I showed up to do that. Right. So I have battle scars of seeing more than I can discuss, right, around this topic, about how that was done, why that was done. Obviously more detailed points about intelligence, about, what's going on. And so their actions are the ones that have caused the reaction. And so I think as long as they keep heading down this path, then it's appropriate for us to both be offensive in terms of investment and defensive in terms of securing what the American taxpayer has paid to invent.
You mentioned when you were talking about Europe, it caught our ear. They're balkanized, and it's hard to do anything dramatic. And I guess one thing we've noticed on our podcast discussion is, we'll talk about California power, and then Texas power, and then MISO has joined us, and you just see the different parts of the U.S., different states or regions, with different approaches, different rules, all having different effects. Is that something you're a little concerned about? Is just watching how, I think on the positive side, people say it's great, states are experimenting, this is awesome, but on the negative side, you're getting different approaches, different answers, and sometimes it's not going well and it's causing problems. What do you think about the balkanization of U.S. energy policy, if there is any?
Yeah, so I'd approach it a slightly differently, which is you have these balkanized decision-making bodies in the power sector around the United States who also, because of the structures, are incentivized or is structured to not change policy ever. And the reason is that if you change, for example, capacity markets, or how queues are set for who gets interconnected and the rules around that to a large degree, if you change those rules, there's certain power plants are going to win and certain power plants are going to lose. I did some trading at JP Morgan, around the whole energy sector, including around power. And so, clearly things are not working in the power sector, is getting very fragile, because in most power regions, the Cal ISO, ERCOT, the New York ISO, PJM, and the New England ISO, there's probably more, but those ones I know of, in which the last 5 years has been more power plants shut down than have been built. So we're de-electrifying. And there's a lot of reasons. Siting is one reason. Obviously, incentivizing older, more emitting plants to shut down is another reason. But the capacity markets to compensate for available power plants is obviously too low to have available power plants around to cover for these. So we're de-electrifying because of bad rules in these balkanized power systems, which leads you towards, so how do you force them to change the structures? And they think that they're keeping their prices low, but if you look at the actual wholesale power prices in New York, over the last couple of years, they're about up 100% over the year. That's a lot, right? So the inflation that we're seeing in the energy sector, it's very strange, right? You see all-time low natural gas prices, right? We're literally at the bottom of the Henry Hub forward prices in the history of the contract, okay? So you would think that electricity prices would be low, right? Because it's still the marginal power price setter in most markets. Well, it's not, because in many places, and many times during the year, oil now is with 18,000 heat rate, stuff from the 1960s, right, is setting the power prices because we've shut down too much stuff without building stuff that's needed. And so these balkanized markets, as you were referring to, you could say it's great that they could have some flexibility, and I would agree with that. But the problem is that the decision-making process has caused all decision-making to be blocked, and now we're on a downward path.
So I know we've got to let you go. It's very hard. We really appreciate all your time. We, as a closer, last week we had Jigar Shah, and he was talking about everything that's going on at the LPO, at the DOE. And, while we had him, it was interesting. We found ourselves talking about all the other parts of Washington that are impacting energy policy. And no particular order, we hit FTC and SEC, and then the Department of the Interior and BLM. And we kind of had all these, different components, even before you got to the State Department and the White House. How, from your time in Washington, if we were trying to really get our energy act together and get kind of as much harmony as possible, is there anything structurally, from your experience, we could do, whether it was an elevated, a different kind of energy secretary, or a different way in which we talk about energy? Like how at the national level can we harmonize all this, or better work together to get better answers?
Yeah, I do think it's kind of impossible to get all the energy components into one department. So let's take BLM. The BLM land has, and that policy has a lot of things not to do with energy, right? And so how do you strip out just the energy component of BLM and move it into a different department, but leave BLM land for non-energy? I mean, that just wouldn't work, right? Moving the regulatory function of EPA into the EPA does a lot of things that have nothing to do with energy, right? Yeah. And so it doesn't make sense to split EPA, right? To energy versus non-energy. I don't think so, right? So I do think it would be great if energy was all under one bucket and everything could be done there. But I think there's some very practical issues that I don't think energy should be running all of EPA either, right? So just on the flip side. So I don't think moving big buckets around of authority between departments will work. So this is about coordination and dialogue. It's hard in Washington. Everyone likes their own sandbox, likes to make their own decisions. That's understandable. It's just it is what it is. And so the important thing is leadership from the top. Really, it has to come from the president that says, you all will get together under some mechanism, like once a month, all the secretaries are going to get together who cover that area and talk about their cross-cut topics and be consistent about that. That has a good way of forcing those entities to work together. Actually, politicals can get along better than the career staff. The politicals are always like, hey, we're all appointed by the same person. The careers have their own, box that politicals kind of come and go. So that's a bit of a challenge, but I think you could do that. The harder one is regulatory, because as you all know, the regulated entities can't talk to other people about things that they're reviewing, right? So FERC has announced the FERC commissioner can't talk to each other about something. So if they can't talk to each other about an outstanding rule that they're looking at doing, they certainly can't talk to like the Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of Energy, right? And so the regulatory agencies have another layer of actually legal issues. So, but I do think there's a way to force dialogue subject to those legal restrictions to try to get everyone conceptually on the same page, and then periodically specifically on the same page.
I mean, energy retreat at Camp David sounds pretty good, hosted by Paul Dabbar.
No, I think the Biden administration is kind of coordinated. You can agree or disagree with their policies, right? And I think in general, when I was in government, I think we were generally in the same bucket. Even though we may not have talked with BOEM, every second about offshore, but I think we were all pretty coordinated. The big scheme. So I don't get overly worked up about it conceptually at a high level. It's more about the specifics, the specific projects, and so on.
Awesome. Well, as I mentioned, it's hard to let you go, Paul. We really appreciate it. We greatly enjoyed the paper. I know, as I mentioned up front, Arjun has a great time with you interacting, and now he's added the Veriton interaction to his collection. So we all have. We really appreciate your time today.
It's really great. I just got to figure out how to get him to show up to a Dominion event.
Well, I bet he's in. He's got a smile. It looks like he's. Great closer question. Paul, thank you so much. Come see us in Houston, and look forward to our next get together. It's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.